courtroom to a stunned silence. The judge, stern-faced and unwavering, addressed Tiffany directly, reading aloud the verdict that would forever mark the end of her political reign. Tiffany Henyard, you stand convicted of numerous counts of corruption, misuse of public funds, and abuse of power. This court finds you guilty as charged. The weight of those words seemed to hit Henyard like a freight train. For a moment, she appeared frozen, staring ahead as though unable to process the full gravity of the verdict. Her legal team, visibly anxious, exchanged hurried glances, but their attempts to defend her had been futile against the mountain of evidence presented. The room seemed to hold its breath, the silence hanging thick. But it didn't last long. In an instant, Tiffany's mask of composure shattered. She jumped to her feet, her chair clattering to the ground with a loud bang that echoed through the courtroom. Her face, usually painted with a confident smile, was now a furious red. Her eyes locked onto the judge as if daring him to say more. Then, without warning, she turned sharply and stormed toward the exit. The once fearless mayor, who had weathered countless storms, accusations, and controversies, was now reduced to a figure of embarrassment and rage, her high heels pounding the courtroom floor with each furious step. Gasps filled the room as she flung open the door, her voice ringing out with defiance. "This isn't over! You can't silence me!" she shouted, her words hanging in the air long after she had disappeared from view. The room buzzed with whispered shock and disbelief as reporters scrambled to capture the moment on camera. It was clear to everyone in that courtroom Tiffany Henyard's political career had reached its final, most dramatic chapter. The court had spoken, and the overwhelming evidence against her had left no room for doubt. What had once seemed like an unstoppable force in local politics was now on the verge of collapse. Her storming out of the courtroom wasn't just a personal outburst. It was the culmination of everything that had gone wrong for her in the past months. The mounting allegations of corruption, the damning financial reports, the scandalous misuse of taxpayer funds, all of it had come to a head. And Tiffany Henyard's defiant reaction only solidified her image as a leader unwilling to take responsibility for her actions. As Henyard's supporters, once loyal, now divided, began to digest what had just transpired, many questioned whether she could ever recover from such a public humiliation. Her once dominant political empire now lay in tatters, and despite her claims of a comeback, it seemed that the writing was on the wall. The drama of Tiffany Henyard's career had never been more intense, and as the public continued to process the courtroom spectacle, one thing was clear. The once proud mayor of Dalton was about to face a reckoning like no other. Whether she could salvage any semblance of her career or fade into political obscurity would depend on how the fallout from this trial played out. But for now, the drama surrounding her was far from over. The courtroom drama had just reached its most intense moment, and Tiffany Henyard's defiant stance was crumbling under the weight of the federal investigation looming over her. The federal agents, who had quietly watched the entire trial unfold, were now taking center stage. Their presence in the courtroom signaled that the battle wasn't just political, it was legal, and it was personal. Tiffany had always positioned herself as the powerful leader, untouchable and unshakable. But now, standing at the door facing the agents, her facade of control was shattering. Her outburst, laced with frustration and anger, had only amplified her desperation. She screamed at the agents, accusing them of political persecution, but the truth was seeping through the cracks. The agents were there for a reason. They weren't simply passive observers. Tiffany knew that the consequences of this trial would extend far beyond the courtroom. As she was escorted out, the reality set in. The cameras flashing, reporters yelling questions, and her supporters, many of whom had stuck by her side, were now beginning to waver. The narrative she had so carefully crafted was beginning to unravel in real time. Her claims of being a target of a political attack could only go so far when the evidence was mounting against her, and even her most loyal followers were starting to doubt. The federal agent's words were clear. "We need you to accompany us for additional questioning." This wasn't an arrest, not yet, but it sure felt like the beginning of the end. Tiffany's mind raced as the magnitude of the situation settled in. This wasn't just about corruption anymore. Federal investigators were now involved in a much broader probe. The allegations she faced were no longer confined to financial mismanagement and abuse of power. They had escalated into something much more dangerous. Reports leaked from within the investigation suggested that Tiffany was under scrutiny not just for corruption, but for a range of other potential criminal activities. The very nature of her leadership and her alleged manipulation of Dalton's finances were now under federal investigation. It was clear that the web of deceit was far more intricate than anyone had realized, and Tiffany's ability to talk her way out of trouble was no longer enough. Outside the courthouse, a media frenzy awaited her. Cameras captured every moment of her public fall from grace, the relentless questions hounding her. "Will you step down? Is it true the FBI is investigating you?" The words seemed to echo, each one a reminder of how far she had fallen. Tiffany remained silent, refusing to respond to the barrage of questions, knowing that anything she said could only make things worse. But even her silence was telling. Her aura of invincibility had been shattered. With her PR team scrambling to spin the narrative, labeling the federal investigation as a political witch hunt, the damage was already done. The walls were closing in, and Tiffany Henyard was now facing not just a court of public opinion, but a federal investigation that threatened to dismantle everything she had built. What was once a promising political career had now turned into a spectacle of desperation and humiliation. And for the people of Dalton, it seemed like the final chapter in the story of their controversial mayor was beginning to write itself. The real question remained: would Tiffany Henyard survive this ordeal, or was this truly the end of her political empire? As the scandal continued to unravel, Tiffany Henyard's situation became increasingly dire. Leaks of financial mismanagement, intimidation tactics, and even hidden offshore accounts flooded the media. Whistleblowers came forward, exposing that taxpayer dollars meant for community programs were siphoned off into questionable consulting fees and non-existent projects. The deeper the investigation went, the uglier the revelations became. But nothing could prepare the public for the bombshell. An audio recording surfaced online. The conversation allegedly captured Tiffany and a close ally plotting to discredit and intimidate their political enemies. Despite the blurry video, the voice was unmistakable, dripping with arrogance. "They wouldn't dare criticize me. And if they do, we'll make sure they regret it." The clip exploded across social media, instantly going viral. Hashtags like Henyard Expose and Justice for the City flooded timelines, while memes comparing her to notorious corrupt figures dominated feeds. Her once passionate supporters began to question everything. Her inner circle was in disarray, consumed by fear. Desperate to save face, they scrambled to discredit the tape, claiming it was doctored, while PR teams released statements trying to manage the damage. But it was too late. The cracks in her armor were too visible. Even politicians and influencers who had once been her allies began to distance themselves. One cautious politician spoke up, saying, "If these allegations are true, we demand full accountability." Even the media, which had once hailed her as a champion of the people, started turning on her. A primetime anchor, who had once fiercely defended her, now said, "The walls are closing in on Tiffany Henyard, and this time there may be no escape." Inside the interrogation room, Tiffany sat across from federal agents, struggling to keep her composure. The once unshakable leader who was known for controlling every situation now appeared vulnerable. "We just have a few questions," the lead investigator said calmly, placing a thick file on the table. Tiffany, trying to laugh it off, scoffed. "This is ridiculous. You've got nothing on me." But the investigator didn't respond right away. Instead, he flipped open the file and slid a page toward her. Tiffany's eyes followed, and the smile faded from her face. It was a bank statement showing a large deposit from an untraceable shell company tied to a government contract. Her voice faltered. "What's this?" she asked, trying to steady her breath. The investigator slid another document across the table. An email exchange about special favors for certain donors. Tiffany's stomach dropped as she realized the walls were closing in faster than she could defend herself. Then came the final blow. The investigator slid one more piece of paper across the table. A signed document bearing her approval for a deal flagged as suspicious. "You can keep pretending," the investigator said, lowering his voice, "or you can start talking. We have enough to take this all the way." For the first time that day, Tiffany Henyard was speechless. Her once invincible bravado had completely disappeared. The political titan who had ruled with an iron fist was now trapped, her future slipping away. Outside, life moved on. Reporters prepped their evening broadcasts. Social media buzzed with debates over who would replace her. The people of Dalton eagerly awaited the next chapter in the scandal. Tiffany Henyard, who had once held Dalton in her grip, now found herself with no future, standing at the precipice of her own downfall. The question was no longer if she would fall, but how far she would fall before it was all over. Tiffany Henyard, once a dominant figure in politics, known for her ability to control every situation, now sat in a cold, sterile interrogation room. The woman who had effortlessly commanded any room was now boxed in. Her arms were crossed, her polished nails nervously tapping on the metal table. The silence was suffocating. The investigator broke it, his voice calm, yet cutting. "We've dealt with politicians like you before. They all think they're untouchable. Until they're not." Tiffany, never one to back down, forced to smirk, but it didn't reach her eyes. "This is absurd. It's a smear campaign. You have no case," she retorted. Unfazed, the investigator slid another document across the table. A sworn statement from a former aide who had attended key meetings and was now blowing the whistle on Tiffany's alleged misconduct. Her world began to collapse. She glanced toward the door, half expecting her lawyers to come rushing in, but no one came. She was alone. For the first time in her life, Tiffany Henyard felt real fear. The fallout from the federal investigation was swift and explosive. News of Tiffany's interrogation spread like wildfire, and political analysts began speculating about the extent of her alleged corruption. Many drew comparisons to the most infamous political scandals in history. Others predicted she could face jail time. What had started as a smear campaign was now a full-blown political earthquake. Tiffany's allies in the city council, who once supported her without question, turned on her. One trustee said, "We can no longer stand by while taxpayer money is squandered. This administration has failed the city." An emergency session was called, and public opinion shifted dramatically. Tiffany's once loyal supporters began to distance themselves. The media, which had long praised her as a strong leader, now painted her as a failed politician. Unwilling to go down without a fight, Tiffany attempted to regain control of the narrative. Her team released a video message filled with her usual defiance and claims of political persecution. "I've devoted my life to serving this city," she said, her voice steady. "The truth will come out. I will not be intimidated." But the response was overwhelming. The public wasn't buying it. Social media exploded with fury as people posted the damning documents, recordings, and witness statements. Critics, including former allies, were now calling for her resignation. Desperate to save herself, Tiffany called a press conference, but it was too late. "I'm being targeted because I refuse to play by their rules," she declared fiercely. But even she couldn't deny the tightening grip of reality. The media relentlessly pressed her on the leaked bank records and audio tapes where she appeared to threaten political opponents. The story had slipped beyond her control. Then came the ultimate blow. After days of speculation, the FBI, with support from state officials, executed a search warrant at Tiffany's home and office. The sight of federal agents removing laptops, hard drives, and boxes of documents sent shockwaves through the city. But the real symbol of her fall came when Tiffany was arrested, her face etched with disbelief as she was led away in handcuffs. The image spread like wildfire. The powerful politician was now the face of a scandal of monumental proportions. News outlets scrambled to cover the unfolding drama. Legal experts appeared on television explaining the gravity of the charges: fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit bribery. If convicted, Tiffany could face more than 20 years in prison. Public opinion shifted again, and the weight of the evidence seemed undeniable. A plea deal now seemed like her only way out. In a holding cell, Tiffany's world crumbled. It wasn't just the charges. It was the total destruction of her public image. Her team worked frantically to contain the damage, searching for any angle to salvage her reputation. But the tide had already turned. Within hours, her political allies released statements calling for justice and accountability. Even those closest to her were now distancing themselves. But Tiffany wasn't ready to go down quietly. From behind bars, she sent one final message to her lawyers. "This is not the truth. The truth will be revealed." Was it a final act of rebellion or a desperate threat? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain. Tiffany Henyard's reign was over. Her story had evolved from one of power and control to one of corruption, deceit, and the collapse of a political empire. The question now wasn't whether Tiffany got what she deserved, it was whether there was more to the story than the public knew. As the city waited for the next chapter in the saga of Tiffany Henyard's downfall, one thing was clear. Her political career was finished. Those who had once supported her were now watching, waiting for the consequences to unfold. Her rise to power had been eclipsed by the tragic tale of her fall. The media had already moved on to other scandals, but they couldn't help but wonder. Did Tiffany Henyard still hold secrets? Could she make a comeback? Or was this the final chapter in the story of her fall from grace? Only time would tell, but the past showed that even the most corrupt politicians could sometimes find a way back. Would Tiffany Henyard be the exception? Or was this the end of her political career? The coming days would reveal the truth behind the scandal.